At Christmas dinner, my in-laws mocked my gift with "You're nothing." So the room went silent when my lawyer arrived. The crystal chandelier above the dining table cast fractured light across the faces of people who had never truly accepted me. I sat there, my hands folded in my lap, feeling the weight of their judgment pressing down on my shoulders like a physical thing. The Montgomery family Christmas dinner had always been an exercise in endurance, but this year felt different. This year I could feel something building in the air, something electric and dangerous, like the moment before a storm breaks. My name is Rachel Chin, and I married into the Montgomery family 5 years ago. My husband David is the love of my life, but his family has always seen me as an outsider. The Chinese girl who somehow trapped their golden boy. The woman who wasn't good enough, would never be good enough, could never possibly deserve a place at their table. David sat beside me, his hand occasionally finding mine under the table, squeezing gently as if to say, "I'm here, I'm with you." But even his presence couldn't shield me from the cutting remarks, the pointed looks, the way his mother Patricia would wrinkle her nose whenever I spoke, as if my words themselves carried an offensive odor. The dining room of the Montgomery estate was exactly as I remembered from previous years. Oppressively elegant, with its mahogany furniture and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to glare down at me with the same disdain as their living descendants. The Christmas tree in the corner was a 12-foot Douglas fir, decorated with ornaments that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Everything about this house screamed old money, old families, old prejudices that refused to die. "Rachel, dear," Patricia said, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she passed the gravy boat to David's father, Richard. "I don't believe you've told us what you do for work these days. Still at that little nonprofit." The way she said "little nonprofit" made it sound like I was playing house, like my work coordinating housing assistance for homeless families was some sort of hobby rather than a calling that consumed 60 hours of my week and most of my emotional energy. "Yes," I said, keeping my voice steady. "We just secured a grant that will help us house 15 more families before the new year." "How quaint," Patricia murmured, and I saw David's jaw clench beside me. His sister Amanda laughed from across the table, the sound sharp and cruel. Amanda was 35, 3 years older than David, and had never forgiven him for being the favored child despite being younger. She'd transferred that resentment to me the moment we met, as if I were somehow responsible for the dynamics of their childhood. 15 families, Amanda repeated mockingly. "And what did that cost, Rachel? In grant money, I mean. Because I'm sure the Montgomery Foundation has donated more than that to single causes before." "Amanda," David warned, but his sister just smiled, taking a long sip of her wine. David's brother Marcus sat at the end of the table, silent as always, his wife Jennifer whispering something in his ear that made him smirk. Marcus was the oldest, the heir apparent to the family business, Montgomery Industries, a manufacturing empire built over 4 generations that was now worth somewhere in the billions. He'd always treated me with cold indifference, as if acknowledging my existence would somehow diminish him. "Well," Richard said, clearing his throat in that pompous way he had, "shall we move on to gifts? I believe that's the tradition, isn't it?" Christmas dinner followed by the opening of presents. My stomach dropped. I'd known this moment was coming, had been dreading it for weeks. The gift exchange was always a minefield, another opportunity for the Montgomerys to demonstrate their wealth and my inadequacy. Last year Amanda had given David a Rolex. Marcus had given him keys to a vintage Porsche. His parents had given him stock options worth more than I'd earn in a decade. I'd given him a handmade photo album, filled with pictures from our life together, each one accompanied by a note about why that moment mattered to me. David had cried when he opened it, had held me close and told me it was the most meaningful gift he'd ever received. His family had looked at it with barely concealed contempt, as if I'd handed him garbage wrapped in newspaper. This year I'd agonized over what to give. Money was tight. It was always tight on a non-profit salary, especially when David had insisted we live on our own income rather than drawing from his trust fund. He'd wanted us to build our own life, independent of his family's wealth, and I'd loved him even more for it. But it meant that I couldn't compete with Rolexes and Porsches. So I'd made something again. Something from the heart, because that's all I had to give. We moved to the living room, where more wrapped packages than any group of people could reasonably need were stacked beneath the enormous tree. I watched as David's family exchanged their gifts. Expensive jewelry, designer clothes, electronics that cost more than my monthly rent, trips to exotic locations, investments in bonds and material things that proved how much money they had to throw around. When it came time for me to give David my gift, I felt every eye in the room on me. I reached into my bag with trembling hands and pulled out a small wrapped package. It wasn't much to look at. I'd wrapped it myself in simple brown paper tied with twine, with a sprig of pine I'd picked from our own small Christmas tree at home tucked under the string. David took it with gentle hands, smiling at me in that way that made me remember why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. He was nothing like his family. He'd somehow grown up in this house of judgment and coldness and emerged warm, compassionate, genuinely kind. He unwrapped the paper carefully, not tearing it like his siblings had done with their gifts. Inside was a leather-bound journal, the kind with handmade paper and a clasp that closed with a small brass lock. On the cover, I'd burned words with a woodbending tool I'd borrowed from a friend. Our adventures. David opened it and I watched his eyes scan the first page. I'd filled the journal with plans, adventures I wanted us to have together. Not expensive vacations or luxury experiences, but real moments. Camping trips to national parks. A road trip along the coast with no schedule and no plan. Volunteering together at a soup kitchen. Learning to dance. Growing a garden. Building a life filled with experiences rather than things. On each page I'd drawn little illustrations and written descriptions of why I wanted to do these things with him. The journal was my heart on paper, my dreams for our future, my promise that even though I couldn't give him material wealth, I could give him a life full of meaning and love and adventure. Rachel, David breathed, and I saw tears gathering in his eyes. This is... What is it? Patricia interrupted, her voice sharp with curiosity and something else. Something uglier. David held up the journal and I watched his mother's face as she processed what she was seeing. Her lip curled slightly, almost imperceptibly, but I caught it. I'd gotten good at reading the micro-expressions of contempt over the years. It's a journal, David said, his voice thick with emotion. Rachel filled it with all these plans for adventures we can have together. It's incredible. Adventures. Amanda repeated, and that laugh came again, that sharp, cutting sound. You mean like actual activities? Things you have to do? Well, Patricia said, setting down her wine glass with a decisive click, that's certainly creative. Though I'm not sure I understand the point. David, darling, you have access to the best travel agents in the world. If you wanted adventures, you could book them. You could go anywhere, do anything. You don't need a little book of suggestions. It's not about that, Mother, David said, his voice tight. It's about Rachel wanting to share experiences with me. It's about us building memories together. How sweet, Jennifer said, her tone making it clear she thought it was anything but. Though I have to say, Rachel, it does seem a bit underwhelming. Compared to everything else, I mean. She gestured to the pile of expensive gifts surrounding David. The new laptop from Marcus, the designer watch from Amanda, the envelope from his parents that I knew contained either stock certificates or a substantial check. I think it's perfect, David said firmly, pulling me close and kissing the top of my head. It's the best gift here. Of course you'd say that, Richard interjected, his voice booming across the room. You're being polite. But let's be honest, son. A handmade journal? When you could have anything in the world. It's a bit insulting, isn't it? The room went quiet. I felt my face burning, felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes that I absolutely refused to let fall. Not here. Not in front of them. Dad, David started, his voice low and dangerous, but Marcus cut him off. Come on, little brother. We're all thinking it. Rachel, you're a sweet girl and all, but this is just embarrassing. A journal? Really? What are you, 12 years old? This is what you give someone for a middle school graduation, not for Christmas when you're married into one of the wealthiest families in the state. I think what Marcus is trying to say, Amanda added, leaning forward with false concern painted across her face, is that maybe you should consider whether you're really equipped to be part of this family. I mean, we all appreciate that you work hard at your little job, but David deserves someone who can match his lifestyle, his expectations. Someone who understands what it means to be a Montgomery. And you clearly don't, Patricia said, her voice ice cold now. All pretense of politeness dropped. You've never understood. You come from nothing, Rachel. Your parents were immigrants who worked in a laundromat. You went to a state school. You work for pennies helping people who should really just help themselves. And you think a handmade journal is an appropriate gift for our son. Stop, David said, standing up, his voice shaking with rage. All of you just stop. We're not trying to be cruel, darling, Patricia continued, turning her attention to her son. We're trying to help you see reason. You married beneath yourself. We've all tried to accept it, tried to make Rachel feel welcome, but she just doesn't fit. She'll never fit. And gifts like this just prove it. She's nothing, David. She comes from nothing, she has nothing, and she'll never be anything more than a charity case you took pity on. The words hung in the air like poison. She's nothing. The two words that crystallized everything they'd ever felt about me, everything they'd been implying for 5 years but had never quite said out loud until now. I felt David's hand tighten around mine, felt him about to explode at his family, but before he could say anything, before I could react, before anyone could break the terrible silence that followed Patricia's pronouncement, the doorbell rang. It was a jarring sound, cutting through the tension like a knife. We all froze, looking at each other in confusion. The Montgomerys didn't get unexpected visitors, especially not on Christmas evening. Richard frowned, checking his watch. Who on earth would be calling at this hour? The housekeeper, Mrs. Chin, no relation to me, though the shared surname had been the subject of more than one cruel joke, appeared in the doorway. Excuse me, Mr. Montgomery, but there's a gentleman here to see Mrs. Rachel Montgomery. He says it's urgent. Every head in the room swiveled toward me. I felt my heart start to race, confusion mixing with a strange sense of anticipation. I wasn't expecting anyone. Who could possibly be looking for me here? Well, Patricia said, her voice dripping with disdain, how mysterious. Rachel, do you make a habit of having strange men track you down on Christmas? Though I suppose we shouldn't be surprised. Perhaps this is a friend from your old neighborhood. The implication was clear and disgusting, and I saw David's face go red with rage. But before he could defend me, before anyone could say anything else, a man appeared in the doorway behind Mrs. Chen. He was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and an expensive suit that even the Montgomerys would have to acknowledge as quality. He carried a leather briefcase and had the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. When he spoke, his voice was professional, crisp, and utterly confident. Good evening. My name is Harrison Beck. I'm a senior partner at Beck, Winters & Associates. I apologize for the intrusion on your family gathering, but I have urgent business with Mrs. Rachel Chen Montgomery. The room had gone completely silent. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking, completely bewildered. I'm Rachel, I managed to say. But I don't understand. I don't know you. Why are you here? Harrison Beck smiled at me, and there was something almost paternal in his expression. "Mrs. Montgomery, I'm here because my firm has been searching for you for the past 18 months. We represent the estate of your late grandmother, Mei Lin Chen." I felt the floor shift beneath me. My grandmother had died 2 years ago, back in Taiwan. I'd never met her. She'd cut off contact with my father when he moved to America, ashamed that he'd chosen what she saw as a life of poverty and hard work over staying in Taiwan to run the family business she and my grandfather had built. My father had never talked about her much, the pain of that rejection too deep even decades later. "I don't understand," I said again. "My grandmother. She wanted nothing to do with us. She disowned my father." "That's what she wanted your father to believe," Harrison Beck said gently. "But Mrs. Chen never stopped watching over your family. She knew about you, Rachel. She knew about your work, your kindness, your dedication to helping others. And she deeply regretted the rift with your father. She spent the last 20 years of her life trying to figure out how to bridge that gap, how to make amends." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Your grandmother passed away 2 years ago, as you know. But what you don't know is that she left a very detailed will. A will that leaves the entirety of her estate to you." The words didn't make sense. I looked at David, who looked as confused as I felt. "Estate," I repeated. "But my grandmother. My father said she ran a small business. A restaurant or something." Harrison Beck's smile widened. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman, Mrs. Montgomery. She started with a single noodle shop in Taipei. By the time she died, she owned one of the largest restaurant chains in Taiwan. Over 300 locations across Southeast Asia. She also had significant real estate holdings and investments." He pulled out a document and handed it to me. I stared at the numbers, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. "The total value of your inheritance, Mrs. Montgomery, is approximately $2.3 billion. As of today, you are one of the wealthiest women in America." The folder fell from my hands. I heard gasps from around the room, heard Patricia make a strangled sound, heard something that might have been a wine glass shattering on the floor. But all I could do was stare at this man who had just walked into the Montgomery house and turned my entire world upside down. "That's impossible," I whispered. "That can't be real." "I assure you it's quite real. Your grandmother spent the last years of her life setting up trusts, organizing her assets, and ensuring that everything would pass to you upon her death. She left you a letter as well." He pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age, with my name written on it in characters I couldn't read. "She wrote this the day before she died. I had it translated for you." I took the envelope with numb fingers. Around me I could feel the Montgomery family frozen in shock, could feel the air thick with disbelief in something else, something that might have been fear. I opened the letter, and Harrison Beck began to read the translation aloud, his voice gentle but clear enough for everyone to hear. "My dearest Rachel, my precious granddaughter whom I have never met but have loved from afar. By the time you read this, I will be gone, and I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive an old woman's pride and stubbornness. I made a terrible mistake 40 years ago when I turned my back on your father. I thought he was throwing away his future, trading honor and success for a hard life in a foreign country. I was wrong. He was choosing love and freedom and the chance to build something of his own. He was being brave, and I was being a coward, too afraid to let go of my plans for him, too proud to admit that his dreams were just as valid as mine. I have watched you from afar, Rachel. I have seen the woman you've become. Your kindness, your dedication to helping others, your strength in facing a world that has not always been welcoming to you. You are everything I hoped my granddaughter would be. You have your father's brave heart and I hope some of my business sense. I leave you everything I have built, not as payment or compensation but as a tool. Use it to continue the good work you are doing. Use it to prove to anyone who has ever looked down on you that worth is not determined by birth or circumstance, but by character and choice. Most importantly, use it to be happy. I wasted too many years being proud and lonely. Don't make the same mistake. Your loving grandmother, Mei Lin Chen. By the time he finished reading, I was crying openly, tears streaming down my face as I clutched this letter from a woman I'd never known but who had somehow seen me, truly seen me, across an ocean and a lifetime of separation. The room remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the heavy, judgmental silence from before, but a stunned, almost frightened quiet. Harrison Beck wasn't finished. He turned to address the room at large, his professional demeanor never wavering but his voice taking on an edge of steel that made me think he knew exactly what kind of family he'd walked into. Mrs. Montgomery has complete control over the estate, of course, but there are a few provisions in her grandmother's will that she should be aware of immediately. First, there is a trust set up specifically for charitable giving, $1 billion earmarked for organizations that support immigrant families, housing assistance and educational programs. Your grandmother wanted to ensure that the work you do, Mrs. Montgomery, could continue on a much larger scale. I put my hand over my mouth, barely able to breathe. $1 billion for the causes I cared about. It was incomprehensible. Additionally, Harrison Beck continued, and now I could see the hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Your grandmother left specific instructions about family. She was very clear that while the money is yours to do with as you wish, she hoped you would remember where you came from. She hoped you would honor your father and mother who sacrificed so much to give you opportunities. And she added a rather pointed note that I think, given the context of this evening, you might appreciate. He pulled out another document and read, "My granddaughter may face people who judge her for her background, her race, her perceived lack of status. To those people I say this. My granddaughter is worth more than you will ever be, not because of the money I leave her but because of who she is. The money simply ensures that she will never again have to listen to small-minded people tell her she is less than she is. She is everything." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched Patricia's face cycle through expressions: shock, disbelief, calculation, and finally, a kind of desperate panic as she realized what had just happened. Amanda had gone white as a sheet. Marcus was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. Jennifer looked like she might be sick. And Richard, pompous, condescending Richard, looked like someone had struck him across the face. "Well," Harrison Beck said cheerfully, closing his briefcase. "I have papers for you to sign, of course, Mrs. Montgomery, but that can wait until after the holiday. I know this is a lot to process. My office will be in touch after Christmas to begin the formal transfer of assets. For now, I just wanted to make sure you knew. Your grandmother wanted you to know on Christmas specifically. She said in her will that she hoped it would be the best Christmas gift you'd ever received." He handed me his card, gave a polite nod to the room and showed himself out. We listened to his footsteps recede down the hallway, heard the front door open and close, and then there was nothing but silence and the ticking of the enormous grandfather clock in the corner. I looked down at the handmade journal David still held in his hands, at the simple leather and the words I'd burned into the cover. Our adventures. Such a small, humble gift. The gift they had mocked. "You're nothing," Patricia had said. "She's nothing. She comes from nothing." I looked up at her now, at this woman who had spent 5 years making me feel worthless, and I felt something inside me straighten, strengthen, solidify. I thought about my grandmother who I'd never met but who had seen me, who had believed in me, who had spent years watching from afar and building something to give me not just money, but power and choice and freedom. "I need to make a phone call," I said quietly. My voice was steady now, all traces of tears gone. "David, can we step outside for a moment?" David followed me out to the hallway, his face a mixture of shock and something that looked like pride. The moment we were alone, he pulled me into his arms. "Rachel," he breathed into my hair. "Oh my God, Rachel. Did that really just happen?" "I think so," I said, still trying to process it all. "David, I need to call my parents. They don't know. They never knew about any of this." I called my father with shaking hands. It was late, but he answered on the second ring. Always a light sleeper, always ready in case someone needed help at the laundromat even after all these years. "Way. Dad," I said and my voice broke. "Dad, something happened. Something incredible. Your mother, Grandmother Mei Lin, she left me everything. Her business, her money, all of it. And she left a letter. He said she was sorry. She said she loved us. she said. I couldn't continue. My father was crying on the other end of the line, great heaving sobs that spoke of 40 years of pain and rejection finally finding release. My mother took the phone, confused and worried, and I explained it all again, listening to her gasp and cry and laugh in disbelief. This is a miracle, my mother said. A Christmas miracle. Your grandmother, she saw you, Bao Bei. She saw your beautiful heart. When I hung up, David was leaning against the wall, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Are you okay? I asked him. He laughed, the sound a bit hysterical. Am I okay? Rachel, you just became a billionaire. In my parents' living room. Right after they spent 20 minutes telling you that you're nothing and you don't belong in this family. I'm more than okay. I'm trying not to dance. David, I said seriously, taking his hands. This doesn't change anything between us. I'm still me. I still want the same life we were building together. I know, he said, kissing me softly. I know that. But Rachel, you have to admit, the timing is pretty spectacular. And the look on my mother's face. We both started laughing then, slightly manic laughter born of stress and shock and the absurdity of what had just transpired. We should go back in, I said finally. We should. I don't know what we should do. When we walked back into the living room, the Montgomery family hadn't moved. They were frozen in their positions like a twisted tableau, everyone staring at us as we entered. Patricia was the first to speak, and I watched in fascination as she attempted to rearrange her features into something resembling warmth. It was like watching a mask being put on in real time. Rachel, she said, and her voice was entirely different from before. Syrupy, sweet, almost desperate. Rachel, darling, I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. We were just joking earlier, you know how families tease each other. We never meant to actually hurt your feelings. Your gift is lovely, truly so thoughtful and personal. Mother, David said, his voice cold. Stop. But Patricia continued as if he hadn't spoken, standing and moving toward me with her arms outstretched as if to embrace me. And we're so happy for you, sweetheart. This inheritance, it's wonderful news. Your grandmother must have been an incredible woman. I wish we could have met her. Perhaps now we can travel to Taiwan together. You can show us your family's business. You called her nothing, I said quietly, stopping Patricia in her tracks. Less than an hour ago you called me nothing. You said I came from nothing, I had nothing, and I would never be anything more than a charity case your son took pity on. I was upset, Patricia said quickly, her mask slipping slightly to show the panic underneath. I'd had too much wine. I didn't mean it. Your family, Rachel. Your Montgomery Dow. We take care of our own. Dow, I'm family? I asked. Now that you know I'm worth $2.3 billion, suddenly I'm good enough? Suddenly I belong. Rachel, please, Amanda interjected, and she actually had the audacity to look hurt. We've always tried to make you feel welcome. Maybe we weren't perfect, but we did try. And now, well, now we can all move forward. We're so proud of you. And if you need any help managing all that money, Marcus has excellent financial advisors who... No, I said simply. The word hung in the air. Amanda blinked at me, confused. No. No, you haven't always tried to make me feel welcome. You've spent 5 years making me feel like an intruder in my own family. Every holiday, every family dinner, every single interaction has been an opportunity for you to remind me that I don't belong, that I'm not good enough, that I'm somehow less than you. I looked at each of them in turn. Patricia, Richard, Amanda, Marcus, Jennifer, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time without the haze of desperate hope that they might someday accept me. My grandmother left me that money because she recognized something in me. She saw my work, my values, the life I've chosen to live. She saw that I use what I have, which until today wasn't much, to help others. She saw that I measure worth by character, not by bank accounts or family names. I picked up the journal from where David had set it on the coffee table, holding it up for them to see. This gift that you mocked, this embarrassing journal, this represents more love than all your expensive presents combined. Every page is something I want to share with my husband, experiences I want us to have together, memories I want us to build. It's not about money. It's about life. It's about actually living instead of just accumulating things to prove you're alive. Rachel, Richard started, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd heard so many times before, but I cut him off. I'm not finished. Here's what's going to happen. That $1 billion my grandmother earmarked for charity? I'm going to use it. I'm going to expand my nonprofit into something that can help thousands of families instead of just a few dozen. I'm going to fund programs and build housing and make a real difference in people's lives. I paused, letting that sink in. I watched Marcus's expression change as he calculated what that kind of charitable operation might mean, the influence it could bring, the doors it could open. And if any of you want to be part of that, I continued, if you genuinely want to contribute or help or be involved in something meaningful, then I'll consider it. But I will never forget what happened here tonight. I will never forget being called nothing by people who measure human worth in dollar signs. We understand, Patricia said quickly. We do, Rachel. And we're so sorry. We want to make this right. We want to be a real family with you. I looked at David, who was watching me with an expression of complete love and pride. He squeezed my hand, supporting whatever I chose to do next. Maybe, I said finally. Maybe we can build something better. But it starts with respect. Real respect, not the fake kind that only appears when someone has money. I'm the same person I was an hour ago. The only thing that changed is you know about my grandmother's fortune. But I'm the same woman who walked in here tonight. The same woman you've been treating like dirt for 5 years. Of course, Richard said, nodding vigorously. You're absolutely right. And we'll do better. We promise. I wanted to believe them. Part of me, the part that still hoped for family harmony and acceptance, wanted to take their apologies at face value and move forward. But I'd spent too many years learning to recognize insincerity. Actions, I said simply. Not words. Show me through your actions that you mean it. The rest of the evening was awkward, to say the least. The Montgomerys tried desperately to be kind, to be welcoming, to undo 5 years of cruelty in a single night. It was almost painful to watch, their sudden reversal so transparent and desperate that even they seemed to recognize how hollow it appeared. David and I left shortly after, claiming exhaustion, which wasn't entirely untrue. I felt like I'd lived an entire lifetime in the span of a few hours. In the car on the way home, David was quiet for a long time, just holding my hand as he drove through the dark streets. Are you going to forgive them? He asked finally. I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to. They're your family and I love you, and I want to be able to spend holidays with them without feeling like I'm walking through a minefield. But I also discovered that my grandmother had been meticulous in her planning. She'd set up trusts, established corporate structures, and created frameworks that would allow me to manage the wealth without being consumed by it. She'd even left detailed notes about which advisors to trust and which to avoid, recommendations for charitable causes she believed in, and strategies for maintaining the businesses she'd built. But the most precious discovery came in a box Harrison Beck delivered to me 3 weeks after Christmas. It was filled with letters, hundreds of them, that my grandmother had written over the years but never sent. Letters to my father apologizing for her stubbornness and pride. Letters to my mother thanking her for raising such a wonderful daughter. And letters to me. They started when I was born and continued through every major milestone of my life. My first day of school. My high school graduation. My acceptance to college. My wedding day. She'd written about watching me from afar, about the private investigators she'd hired to send her photos and updates, about her pride in the woman I was becoming and her deep regret that her own pride had kept her from knowing me directly. I watch you help others, she'd written in a letter dated just months before her death, and I see the best of our family. Not the money or the business success but the compassion. You chose a hard path, Rachel. You chose to use your talents to lift others up rather than to accumulate wealth for yourself. That is true success. That is what I should have taught your father. That is what I failed to understand until it was too late. I cried reading those letters, mourning the relationship we never got to have while feeling grateful for the connection we'd forged across distance and time through her observations and my unknowing performance of a life that would have made her proud. My parents came to visit a month after Christmas. We sat in our apartment. I decided not to move immediately, wanting to process everything before making big changes. And I showed them the letters, the documents, the evidence of a love that had persisted despite years of silence. My father wept as he read his mother's words. "She was so stubborn," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "So proud. I thought she hated me for leaving. For choosing your mother and America over the family business." "She never hated you," I said gently. "She was hurt and she didn't know how to bridge the gap she'd created. But she never stopped loving you. Look." I showed him a letter she'd written on his 50th birthday, filled with memories of his childhood, pride in the man he'd become, and sorrow that she'd let her ego keep them apart. "She wanted to reach out so many times," my mother said, reading over his shoulder. "But she didn't know how. Well, this is so sad. All these wasted years." "But not wasted," I said. "She spent those years building something she could give back. She spent them watching over us, making sure we were okay, creating opportunities. She couldn't be here in person, but she was present in her own way. We spent that day together, the three of us, reading letters and crying and laughing at stories my father told about his childhood in Taiwan. Stories I'd never heard before because talking about his mother had always been too painful for him. "What will you do with all of it?" my father asked eventually. "The money, the businesses?" "I'm going to use it the way Grandmother Mei Lin wanted," I said. "I'm going to help people. David and I are setting up the foundation. We're going to focus on 3 areas: housing assistance for families in crisis, educational programs for first-generation immigrants, and small business grants for women entrepreneurs." "Your grandmother would love that," my mother said, squeezing my hand. "Especially the business grants. She started with nothing, just a small noodle cart and a dream. She would want other women to have that same chance. As for the Montgomery family, they tried. I'll give them that." Patricia called weekly, inviting us to lunch or dinner, attempting to build bridges she'd spent years burning. Amanda sent gifts. Expensive gifts that missed the point entirely, but gifts nonetheless. Marcus and his wife stopped by the nonprofit one day, offering to volunteer, though they looked so uncomfortable surrounded by the people we served that I knew their hearts weren't really in it. Richard was perhaps the most changed. He'd cornered David one day and admitted, with what seemed like genuine remorse, that he'd been wrong about me. That he'd let prejudice and classism blind him to who I really was. He didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't make excuses, just acknowledged his failures and said he hoped to do better. "Your father apologized to me," I told David that night. "I know. He told me he was going to." "Do you believe him?" I thought about it. I think he means it. But I also think changing beliefs and attitudes that have been ingrained for decades isn't easy. He can want to be better and still struggle with actually being better. "So what do? We give them chances," I said. "But we also protect ourselves. We don't have to accept cruelty just because it's coming from family. We can love them and have boundaries at the same time." Over the next few months, we established new patterns with David's family. We attended some events but skipped others. We were polite but no longer desperate for their approval. And slowly, grudgingly, they began to actually see me, not as David's wife or as an inconvenience or as a billionaire, but as a person. The real test came 6 months after that fateful Christmas dinner. Patricia called to invite us to Easter brunch, and I could hear the hesitation in her voice, the expectation that I'd say no. "We'll come," I said, surprising both her and myself. "But we're bringing my parents." There was a pause. "Your parents?" "Yes. My father and mother. If you want us to be family, Patricia, then you need to accept my whole family. My parents are wonderful people and I want you to know them." Another pause, longer this time. Then, "Of course. We'd be delighted to meet them. Is there anything special I should prepare? Any dietary restrictions?" It was such a small thing, asking about dietary needs, but it was the first time Patricia had ever shown consideration for my background or culture. It felt like a tiny crack in a very large wall. Easter brunch was awkward, but it was a different kind of awkward. My parents arrived dressed in their best clothes, nervous and formal, and I watched the Montgomery family really see them for the first time. My father's calloused hands from years of hard work. My mother's careful English, still accented after decades in America. Their obvious love for each other and for me. And I watched something shift in Patricia's face as she listened to my father talk about leaving Taiwan, about building a life from nothing, about the sacrifices he and my mother had made to give me opportunities. She saw, perhaps for the first time, that poverty doesn't equal lack of worth. That working class doesn't mean lesser than. That my family's story was one of courage and love and determination. "Your father is remarkable," Patricia said to me quietly while the others were talking. "Both your parents are. The way they speak about you, the pride in their voices. I'm ashamed of how I treated you, Rachel. Truly ashamed. I let prejudice and snobbery blind me to the fact that you come from a family with more integrity and genuine love than mine has ever had." "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. It wasn't a complete transformation. People don't change overnight, but it was a start. David and I launched the May Lynchen Foundation in the fall. The opening ceremony was held at a community center in the neighborhood where my parents still lived, where I'd grown up. We could have held it somewhere fancy, somewhere that would attract more press and attention, but I wanted to honor my grandmother by starting where it mattered most, in the communities that needed help. My parents cut the ribbon. David gave a speech about the importance of seeing humanity in everyone, regardless of background or circumstances. And I talked about my grandmother, about the power of love that persists even through separation and silence, about building bridges instead of walls. The Montgomery family attended. All of them. They sat in folding chairs in a modest community center, surrounded by immigrant families and nonprofit workers and people who looked nothing like them. And they stayed for the whole thing. They shook hands with our clients, listened to their stories, and, I could see it happening, began to understand what I'd been trying to tell them all along. Worth isn't measured in bank accounts. Success isn't defined by stock portfolios. Family isn't about blood or last names. It's about showing up. It's about seeing people. It's about choosing love over prejudice, compassion over judgment, connection over division. A year after that Christmas dinner, David and I finally used the journal. We took 3 months off and did every single adventure I'd written about. We camped in national parks and got eaten alive by mosquitoes. We drove along the coast with no plan and got gloriously lost. We volunteered at soup kitchens and learned to dance badly and planted a garden that mostly died but produced a few triumphant tomatoes. We spent money on some things: better camping gear, a reliable car for road trips. But we discovered that my grandmother had been right. Money was a tool, not an identity. It gave us freedom and choices, but it didn't change who we were or what mattered to us. The foundation flourished. In the first year, we housed over 300 families. We provided scholarships to 80 first-generation college students. We gave grants to 45 women entrepreneurs. And we were just getting started. My grandmother's businesses continued to run smoothly under the management teams she'd carefully selected over the years. I learned the operations, involved myself in strategic decisions, but I didn't let it consume me. I remained who I'd always been, someone who measured success by impact rather than profit margins. On the second anniversary of that Christmas dinner, David and I hosted our own celebration. We invited my parents, some close friends, colleagues from the foundation, and yes, the Montgomery family. But we also invited the families we'd helped, the people whose lives had been changed by my grandmother's generosity and my determination to use it well. Patricia arrived with her arms full of homemade dishes. She'd asked my mother for recipes and had spent days learning to cook them. Richard brought a check for the foundation, a substantial donation made without fanfare or expectation of recognition. Amanda and Marcus came with their children and spent the evening playing with kids from the families we'd helped, getting messy and loud and real in ways I'd never seen from them before. It wasn't perfect. The Montgomerys still had their moments of obliviousness, still occasionally said things that revealed prejudices they were working to unlearn. But they were trying. Really trying. And that mattered. "I found something," David said to me as we stood in the kitchen late that night, watching our strange blended family through the doorway. "In my grandmother's attic." My father's grandmother, I mean. The original Montgomery matriarch. He handed me a letter, yellowed with age, written in careful script. It's from 1920, David said. When my great-great-grandmother was young. Her family opposed her marriage to my great-great-grandfather because he was an Irish immigrant, poor and Catholic in a neighborhood that was neither. They cut her off completely. She never spoke to her parents again. I read the letter, a heartbroken plea from a young woman to parents who refused to see her or her new husband, begging them to reconsider, to meet him, to understand that love and character mattered more than social standing. My family, David said quietly, built their fortune on the very same kind of prejudice they showed you. They climbed up by looking down on others. And somewhere along the way they forgot that they started as the outsiders, as the people who weren't good enough, as the immigrants who had to fight for every inch. So did mine, I said. My grandmother could have reached out to my father any time. She let pride keep them apart for decades. We all have this capacity for prejudice and judgment. The question is whether we let it define us or whether we fight against it. David pulled me close. Your grandmother fought against it in the end. She spent the last years of her life building something that would help you tear down the walls she'd built. That's legacy, Rachel. That's redemption. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and it was just David and me cleaning up, I found the journal again. The one I'd given him 2 Christmases ago, the one his family had mocked. The gift that had seemed so inadequate next to their expensive offerings. We did them all, David said, looking over my shoulder at the pages filled with checked-off adventures. Every single one. We did, I agreed. Want to fill it with new ones? So we sat at our kitchen table. We'd bought a house by then, modest by Montgomery standards but perfect for us, and we wrote new adventures. New dreams. New plans for a future we were building together, one experience at a time. I thought about my grandmother, about the gift she'd given me. Not the money, though that had certainly changed my circumstances, but the validation. The proof that I had worth regardless of what anyone else thought. The knowledge that she'd seen me, truly seen me, and found me worthy. I thought about that Christmas dinner, about Patricia's cruel words echoing through the ornate dining room. You're nothing. She comes from nothing, she has nothing, and she'll never be anything more than a charity case. She'd been wrong. But even if Harrison Beck had never shown up, even if I'd never inherited a penny, she would have still been wrong. I'd never been nothing. I'd been working to help people, using what little I had to make a difference, building a life based on values rather than valuables. The money just made it louder. Made it impossible for people like Patricia to ignore. Made it undeniable that worth doesn't come from circumstances of birth but from choices made every single day. What are you thinking about? David asked, noticing my faraway expression. That your mother called me nothing, I said. And 5 minutes later I became something in her eyes. But I was always something, David. I was always valuable. I just needed to believe it myself. You've always been everything to me, David said simply. Long before we knew about your grandmother's fortune. You're everything because of who you are, not what you have. I leaned into him, feeling grateful for this man who'd seen me from the beginning, who'd loved me when his family rejected me, who'd chosen our small life together over his family's wealth and expectations. I want to tell you something, I said. Something I've been thinking about for a while now. What's that? I want to have a baby. I want to start our family. And I want to raise our children to understand that worth comes from character, not from bank accounts. That helping others is more important than impressing them. That love is the only currency that really matters. David's eyes filled with tears. I want that too. More than anything. And I want to make sure they know about their great-grandmother May Lynn. About how she built something from nothing, how she never gave up even when it was hard, how she used her success to help others. I want them to carry that legacy forward. They will, David promised. Because they'll have you as their mother. And you'll teach them by example the same way you've been doing all along. We sat there in our kitchen, planning a future that felt both enormous and intimate, filled with possibility and purpose. Outside it started to snow, soft flakes drifting past our window, and I thought about how much had changed in 2 years. I thought about that journal, that simple handmade gift that had seemed so inadequate next to Rolexes and stock options. I thought about how the best gifts aren't the ones that cost the most, but the ones that show you truly see someone, truly know them, truly love them. My grandmother had given me the ultimate gift, not just money but recognition. She'd seen me across an ocean and a cultural divide and years of separation, and she'd said, "You matter. You are worthy. You are enough." And in doing so, she taught me to see myself that way too. The Montgomerys still struggled sometimes with their prejudices and their assumptions. But they were learning. And I was learning too. Learning that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, that boundaries can coexist with love, that family can be both given and chosen. A year later, I gave birth to a daughter. We named her May Lynn Montgomery Chin, honoring both sides of her heritage, both halves of who she was and who she would become. The Montgomery family came to the hospital bearing gifts. But this time, Patricia brought something she'd made herself. A baby blanket she'd knitted, simple but made with care, each stitch representing hours of effort and thought. "I'm not very good at this," Patricia admitted, handing me the slightly uneven blanket. "But I wanted to make something with my own hands. Something that came from me, not from my wallet. Rachel, you taught me that the most valuable gifts are the ones that take time and thought and genuine care. I wanted to try to give that to my granddaughter." I took the blanket, imperfect and handmade and so much more meaningful than anything money could buy, and I felt something inside me soften completely. This was what transformation looked like. Not dramatic or instant, but gradual and genuine and hard-won. "It's perfect," I said, and I meant it. "Thank you, Patricia. For this and for trying. For being willing to change." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and for the first time since I'd known her, she hugged me without restraint or reservation. A real hug from a woman who was learning, slowly, imperfectly but sincerely, to see beyond the surface to what really mattered. As I held my daughter that night with David beside me and both our families gathered around, the Montgomerys and the Chens, old money and new, different backgrounds and cultures and histories all converging in this one tiny person, I thought about journeys. About how we can't choose where we start, but we can choose where we go and how we get there. I thought about my grandmother who started with a noodle cart and ended with an empire. About my parents who started with nothing but love and determination and built a life that mattered. About the Montgomery family who started with prejudice and judgment but were slowly, painfully learning to be better. And I thought about that Christmas dinner 2 years ago, about sitting in that ornate dining room feeling worthless and small, about the moment Patricia had said those words that cut so deep, "You're nothing." If I could go back and speak to that version of myself, the one who sat there absorbing abuse because she so desperately wanted to belong, I would tell her this. You don't need them to see your worth for it to exist. You don't need validation from people who measure value in dollars and status. You are already enough, already valuable, already worthy of love and respect and belonging. The money didn't make me something. It just made it impossible for them to pretend I was nothing. But I'd always been something. I'd always mattered. I'd always had worth. I just needed to believe it myself. And now, holding my daughter and surrounded by family, messy, imperfect but trying, I finally did know that real change is hard. And I'm not sure they're capable of it. They apologized tonight because I suddenly have money and influence. But would they have apologized if Harrison Beck had never shown up? Would they have realized how cruel they've been? David squeezed my hand. Probably not. Definitely not, I corrected. David, your mother called me nothing. In front of everyone. She said I'd never be anything more than a charity case. And 5 minutes later, when she found out about my inheritance, suddenly I was family. That doesn't just go away because someone apologizes. No, David agreed. It doesn't. Rachel, I'm so sorry. I should have done more to protect you. I should have stood up to them harder sooner. I knew they were cruel to you, but I kept hoping they'd change, that they'd see what I see in you. It's not your fault, I said gently. You stood up for me tonight. You've always stood up for me. But you can't control your family any more than I can change who they are. We drove in silence for a while, and then David said something that surprised me. Let's not go back. What? For Christmas. For holidays. Let's start our own traditions. We can visit them occasionally if you want to give them a chance to prove they've changed. But we don't have to subject ourselves to their judgment anymore. We can spend our holidays with your parents or our friends or just the two of us. We can build our own family culture, one based on actual love instead of obligation and cruelty. I felt tears welling up again, but these were different tears. These were tears of relief and gratitude. I would love that, I said. When we got home to our small apartment, which I suddenly realized we could now replace with anything we wanted, though the thought felt strange and overwhelming, we sat on our worn couch and I finally allowed myself to process everything that had happened. Read it to me, David said, gesturing to the journal he'd been carrying. Read me the adventures you planned. So I did. I opened the journal and read him each page, describing the camping trips and road trips and simple moments I'd imagined us sharing. And with each page, David's smile grew wider, his eyes grew brighter, and I remembered why I'd married him in the first place. When I finished, he pulled me close and kissed me deeply. These are perfect, he said. Every single one. And we're going to do them all. Every adventure, every experience. Starting tomorrow. Let's drive up the coast with no plan and no schedule. Let's begin living the life you planned in this journal. Tomorrow is the day after Christmas, I pointed out. Don't you want to process everything that happened? Meet with Harrison Beck? Start dealing with the inheritance. That can wait, David said firmly. What can't wait is us. Our life. Our adventures. Rachel, you've spent 5 years trying to prove yourself to people who were never going to accept you. You don't have to prove anything anymore. Not to them, not to anyone. You are exactly enough, exactly as you are. You always have been. I started crying again, the kind of deep, cathartic crying that comes from years of held-back emotion finally being released. David held me through it, stroking my hair and whispering that he loved me, that he'd always loved me, that money changed nothing about who we were to each other. The next morning we packed a bag, got in the car and headed north along the coast with no destination in mind. It was raining, gray and cold, but neither of us cared. We stopped at diners and roadside attractions. We talked about everything and nothing. We began to plan what we'd do with this unexpected fortune. The programs we could start, the families we could help, the difference we could make. I want to name it after her, I said as we sat in a small cafe overlooking the ocean, drinking mediocre coffee and eating toast that was slightly burnt. The foundation or charity or whatever we create, I want to name it after Grandmother May Lin. She gave me this opportunity and I want to honor that. The May Lin Chin Foundation, David said, trying it out. I like it. She'd be proud. Over the next few weeks, as word spread about my inheritance, things changed rapidly. Harrison Beck helped me navigate the complex process of assuming control of my grandmother's various businesses and assets. I learned that she hadn't just owned restaurants. She'd built an empire through smart investments, real estate, and a business acumen that I was only beginning to understand.